February is a month of romance and attraction, a time to celebrate relationships and love, which is why it's so very fitting to discuss one of the most upsetting and unromantic characters of the Silent Hill series, Stanley Coleman. Stanley never shows up on screen. We never see him, but he certainly sees us. The fact that we don't see him reinforces the truly frightening aspect of his character, that he is stalking us and we can do nothing about it. Throughout Silent Hill 3, it's implied he can see our every move, and we don't know when or where he is. In fact, he's likely not in the same time period as us. The Book of Lost Memories basically confirms that Stanley and the actions he takes happen in a different time and are brought together with Heather by the magic of the otherworld. Stanley's name is rather ordinary. The meaning isn't anything special, but it does tie into a figure who had a lot of influence on the Silent Hill series, Stanley Kubrick. He was the director of a few films that Team Silent named as influences, and the team is known for naming characters after famous people they admire. One film in particular stands out, Lolita, the story of a predatory male adult with sexual desires for a female minor. Stanley's actions and behaviors are straight out of Kubrick's Lolita. His last name, Coleman, refers to someone who works in the coal industry. Associations with darkness and fire. Fitting, given where Stanley ultimately ends up. He's a patient at Brookhaven Hospital, but why he's there is questionable. Certainly he is mentally ill, but there's also hints in the letters that something else is at play here. He knows the organization, the Order, and at one point he refers to paradise with a capital P, a concept Claudia constantly discusses and is important to the Order. He mentions that the Order wants him to forget about that, and claims it's the Order behind his being in the asylum. The early games imply the Order had a lot of power and influence in the town, but what could Stanley have seen that would require him to be locked away? He also seems to know about the otherworld. He talks about wanting to meet Heather in a world just for them. How much does Stanley Coleman really know? Stanley leaves a number of letters for Heather, none of which have to be read, but if they are, they give greater context to what's happening in the level. In some other reality and time, Stanley knew, perhaps felt, Heather's entrance into the hospital. He is able to observe her progress, to leave horrific notes for her, and at times, warns her of dangers. It ends with a letter that implies he's going to be killed by Leonard Wolfe, a note that ends abruptly. Apparently he was murdered, and later in the morgue, we'll find him as body number 7. The mysterious voice on the phone confirms it. 7 is an auspicious number, and it's associated with Stanley multiple times. In the morgue, he's number 7, and his room number is S7. 7 is considered a holy, powerful number that gives a sense of completion to the number 6. Christianity has 7 sins and 7 virtues. Buddhism and Taoism have 7 chakras. There were 7 operations in alchemy, 7 colors of the rainbow, 7 days of the week, and in Christian tradition, it is the 7th day that is the holy day of rest. Silent Hill even uses this auspicious number for its own important time periods. Between the ritual that impregnated Alessa and the events of Silent Hill 1, there is a gap of 7 years. Stanley is a horrible person, hardly anyone holy. The association with this number of power and spirituality is a nasty twist on an ancient tradition. But there is also the fact that, in a way, Stanley is a higher power. We can't see him, but he knows and sees us, and appears to have power beyond belief. It's an illusion, but for Heather, it's a terrifying reality that she doesn't know how Stanley's doing any of this. Stanley is a sadistic and terrible person. In his letters, it's clear he doesn't respect or act kindly to anyone. He refers to the doctors as quacks and the nurses as wenches, calls his roommate a liar, and insults Leonard to the point the man kills him. Yet he is full of falsely kind words for Heather. His supposed love for her hides darker desires, which are more clearly revealed in the hard mode version of the game's riddles. The riddle to open the Brookhaven keypad is a poem written by a man to a woman he claims to love, which describes how he would shove his thumb into her eye socket, bite off her tongue and ear, and how delightful it would be. Throughout the letter, he describes how he would let the woman destroy him, yet it's clearly him destroying her. He often displaces his actions and desires like this, putting them on other people. He writes that everyone in Silent Hill is insane except me. And it's Heather who has power over him, if you believe his letters, to draw away attention from the fact that it's Stanley who's the older man who has the power and is using it to threaten and intimidate her. He explains away things he doesn't like, writes that Heather doesn't take the doll because she's embarrassed, though it's clear the true reason is disgust. Anything that doesn't fit his worldview is conveniently rewritten in his mind to fit his own truth. What's curious is that this truth persists until his death. He seems to know about Silent Hill and the other world, but whatever it is he's seen there, it doesn't shake him out of his delusions. In fact, it seems to enable them. The town, after all, allows him to see Heather, but why? What purpose is there in allowing Stanley to leave the notes? Why can Stanley see her in the first place? There are easily multiple ways to interpret this, depending on how you interpret the power that is at work in Silent Hill. But there's one thing that can't be argued about the letters. They warn Heather and the player about Leonard. They reveal the truth of him, how dangerous he is, before Heather goes to face him in battle. The rest of the letters don't tell Heather anything necessary or helpful, but the last letter is a warning for Heather to beware the dangers of the man she's going to face. It's entirely possible the town took advantage of Stanley's obsessive nature, allowed him this connection to Heather, all to facilitate this warning. If you believe in a version of the town that's against the cult and doesn't want the god to be born, because Alessa didn't want the god to be born, then I think this reason explains it perfectly. The doll that's left with the note looks remarkably like a nurse. In fact, it has a few things in common with Lisa, which may simply be because she's the only human nurse the player has met. But it's also another connection to a vulnerable young woman who was used by a predatory male. In the end, the doll is beheaded and broken, one leg torn off, a representation of the violence Leonard is capable of, as the doll is next to the letter Stanley is writing when he's murdered. It may represent a possible fate for Heather if she's not wary of Leonard. One letter in particular has an odd detail in it, a poem written by someone Stanley calls Eric. Besides being a less than auspicious name for a poet, it's hard to imagine where Stanley would have gotten access to poetry in his position, given his habit of lying, like how he says he made the doll for Heather, despite the fact it looks like a doll bought in a store. It's more likely he wrote this poem and tried to give it credence by assigning it to a known poet. What's interesting about the poem is that once again, it discusses a beautiful young woman the speaker is in love with. But the poem describes the speaker as having ebony hair, black hair, not blonde like Heather has now. It's a small detail, but it leads one to wonder just how much Stanley knows. He already knows of the other world and of the cult. Does he know about Alessa? And does he have any idea that Alessa is connected to Heather? The letter in the hard riddle also mentions a physical description. blue eyes, which neither Heather nor Alessa have. Stanley's final fate is a corpse in the morgue of the hospital. If Heather moves close to him, he can be heard sighing. He is part of a riddle, involved in opening the crematorium door to obtain a key. There's 3 versions of this riddle, and all 3 answers have the number 7 in them. The first 2 are simple puzzles with randomized answers. The third, however, is a much more complex riddle. Who killed Cock Robin? The poem in the riddle is taken from an English nursery rhyme by the same name. Its specific origins and meanings are unclear, but it's a few centuries old and may have been related to the death of a king or other historical events. The original poem sets up a different scenario. Cock Robin has been killed. The poet says who killed him, and then moves on to name other creatures who will in some way help with the funeral or act of mourning. But the Cock Robin poem in Silent Hill is much more vague. The animals in the poem are all birds. The original had more than birds, but both poems include all the same birds. All the words are completely different besides the opening line, who killed Cock Robin? The player is meant to decipher which 4 birds match the 4 described in the riddle on the crematorium door, based on a short description of each bird's actions and appearance. Put the numbers associated with the birds in order, and you have the code to the crematorium door. Number 7 in the poem is the linnet, and the note for the bird is found on Gurney 7, Stanley's body. It describes a bird who seeks her out, frightening her, whispering love songs in her ear, clearly connected to Stanley and his behavior with Heather. He is one of the 4 answers to the riddle. He corresponds to the bottomless gut, the heavy body, because of his endless desire for Heather. The other answers are the owl, the sparrow, and the wren. Each of these birds can be associated with characters in the game. It's a scenario that deals with someone who is murdered, and the game has a murder victim. The Cock Robin represents Harry. An interesting bird to choose for the comparison. The robin has long been associated by Western tradition with the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. It's said that the plumage on its chest became red because the bird plucked a thorn from the crown on Jesus' head, which splattered his chest with blood, a story that associates the robin with sacrificial death. The sparrow murdered the robin, which makes the sparrow Claudia. She wants them all dead because she wants to bring paradise, which will literally kill everyone. Honey Sweet is there sobbing because she sees suffering as the road to paradise. The owl is Vincent, someone who forgot the sky, a symbol of eternity and spirituality. He mentions multiple times that he is more interested in the physical world rather than the divine, and he's clearly a greedy person, tying into the he ate and he ate line. Lastly, the wren, a bird with pure heart unrefined, who makes us laugh with feeble lip-smacking, who will never grow old, and who doesn't know how much he's lacking. This is Heather. She's pure-hearted because she's innocent. She has a smart mouth and masks her fear with sarcastic quips. And there is a definite chance she won't grow old. She could die here because she doesn't know what she's lacking. Her memories, her powers, the part of her soul that's Alessa. Symbolically, Heather burns these bodies in the crematorium, 4 birds that represent obstacles in her way, threats that keep her from avenging Cock Robin. One of them is Vincent, who is using her, Claudia, who is trying to ultimately kill her, and herself, because there's still parts of Heather avoiding the truth. The parts that suppress the past, that avoid looking at mirrors, that avoid facing the reality of her father's death. And of course, one of them is Stanley, a man who represents the predatory male adults that Heather will have to face in her life and learn to overcome. But first, she'll have to make it through Silent Hill.